To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study, Evidence for Christianity. As evidence for the Bible's inspiration, we can consider concepts and statements that would relate to knowledge not fully known, or maybe not fully understood by the writer from a scientific perspective at that time. Knowledge outside of what the writer knew would demand a source outside of man, divine. Thus, foreknowledge represents a mark of inspiration. We're going to look at several areas of scientific accuracy and foreknowledge in this class. All right, our first one comes from the very first few chapters of the book of Genesis, the flood. Moses, writing about 3,500 years ago in 1500 BC, recorded details of an event that had occurred about 1,000 years before he was born. The global flood in the days of Noah was such a catastrophic and pivotal event in human history that its story would be passed down from generation to generation, and we see it throughout ancient civilizations around the world. Would Moses have likely been told some of this story verbally? Very possibly. Could it have been passed down from his parents and his grandparents? Maybe so. But just as we've seen throughout the Bible, what Moses writes includes such details that, one, Moses would not have known, and two, would prove to be scientifically useful thousands of years later. The Bible contains known facts and revelation from God, both of those falling under the umbrella of inspiration. And so if Moses had known some of these stories, sure, but what he wrote, pulling in and having revealed to him from God details that he would not have known otherwise. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 includes the details of a boat-like structure, a project so large that it seems out of place, out of time. Critics of the Bible's inspiration have looked at this, and they look at it and they say it seems like a fanciful story. Such an enormous vessel at that time in history, well, that couldn't have occurred. Well, admittedly, we don't have the structure available to see in all its glory today. Just like our discussion of the archaeological evidences, being able to see and hold and touch a physical item, that can be powerful. The ark, based on its construction, made out of wood, it describes in Genesis, was not one meant for long lasting. It was not a monument to God's glory. It was not a monument to Noah's ability. No, there are several possibilities for where it could have come to rest, but for sure, we can't go to a museum and see the ark. However, when we consider its dimensions, scientific considerations have confirmed that the ratio of its dimensions is one that has proven to be one of stability. You see, when we open up the pages of Genesis, it tells us that the ark would be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. That ratio of 30 to 5 to 3 doesn't come from any other place. There's not a previous record within Scripture. There's not a previous record with any historical documents that recounts such a vessel, such a purpose, such a size, and in this type of specificity. The ratio of this 30 to 5 to 3 has been shown to be a desired ratio for cargo carrying extremely stable ships. All right, simply consider that while there are ships of all shapes and sizes, 4,000 to 5,000 years after the time of Noah, all of these vessels of different ratios and sizes, different purposes, did different things, constructed different ways, but yet 3,500 years after Moses recorded the details of the ark, humanity is still using this ratio in shipbuilding. Now, it's not for yachts. It's not for boats meant for speed or distance to some degree. Instead, we find this ratio in boats that would maybe have a slightly similar purpose to the ark. All right, numerous mid-19th century passenger ships, specifically the SS Great Britain as an example, used a ratio almost the same as the ark. The SS Great Britain's ratio was 32.2 by 5 by 3.2. Well, what was the purpose of the SS Great Britain? It wasn't necessarily for speed. It was to carry a large number of passengers, right? To contain them, to bring food along, to bring stores along, to host them in, really at that time, an opulent manner, a manner of wealth and prestige and pleasure. All right, well, the SS Great Britain carried its cargo, its passengers. In World War II, there were some specific ships built by the United States called Liberty ships. These Liberty ships were cargo carrying, right? They needed to take large amounts of materials and goods and things from the United States across the Atlantic, maybe into the Pacific, carrying to supply the troops in other places. So these ships that are designed for carrying cargo, such as a specific example, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, has this very similar ratio to the ark. And then one final example is the fact that across the oceans of our world, ships are carrying livestock. They are carrying animals meant for markets, for meat or for wool or for needs from one country where they are grown and raised, ranched, and then shipped off to other places. Some of these modern livestock carriers have this similar ratio. Again, it's not a ratio meant for speed, but a ratio meant for stability. And one of those such examples is the Zahir 1, carrying livestock from the regions of Australia to the Middle East. Stability. Just like we've discussed, no ship in modern day or in records has had the same purpose that we find in Scripture for Noah's Ark. A floating barge that had no place to go to, no dock to go to, no end point or destination. Instead, it was simply meant to float, to stay aloft, to stay in a safe place, position, stable for almost about 1 year, just a little over 1 year during the global flood. But marine engineering and naval architecture has confirmed that these dimensions that we find written in this ancient record of Genesis are ones that would meet the task even if it was being built today. All right, our second line of reasoning, our second scientific accuracy and foreknowledge, again coming from nature. I want us to think about the oceans. People have been sailing the seas for almost all of human history, right? We just talked about the cataclysmic event of the global flood and how people survived in a boat. Well, since that time, very early after that time, we see records of ships and naval opportunities for nations. Of course, the flood changed geography and arrangement of the continents, but ancient civilizations around the world have since they've had aspects of exploration, industry, trade involving having to navigate the waters. Such understanding of the oceans has been part of human investigation then from that time. They would want to know the starting point. They would want to track out what that ending point would be. They'd have to chart how do we get there? How do we do it safely? So human investigation has been a part of looking at the oceans, understanding travel on the oceans. When we turn to Psalm chapter 8 in Scripture, Psalm 8 speaks about the wonder of God's creation. and how even man is such a small part of creation, but yet God is mindful of him. And then there's a small reference to the seas in verse 8 of Psalm 8. Listen to what it says. The birds of the air and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the seas. All right? In this psalm, the psalmist is talking about the glory of God's creation. And in it, he references those fish that are swimming in the seas, that are swimming in the paths of the seas. Well, that's an interesting phrasing. The psalmist spoke of something possibly considered or observed in the natural world, but really the full understanding would be thousands of years afterward. I'm sure vessels going on the ocean knew about currents, that at times when they neared a river inlet or a river outlet, depending on if they're on a freshwater or ocean water, that they understood that there was a pull, that the water had drag with it that might influence their ships. And so sailing across the oceans, it's understandable that they would understand and recognize that the waves and the wind and that there were these movements. But this reference to paths of the seas has something that's not just the waves are churning or the waves are moving around. So interestingly, we fast forward in time and we come across an individual by the name of Matthew Fontaine Maury. He is sometimes called the pathfinder of the seas or the father of oceanography. And that's because of his contribution in understanding the details of ocean currents. Not just ocean currents on the surface, but deep water. I want to read to you a quote from Maury, where he talks about his perspective in dealing with the ocean and trying to understand what he saw. All right, here's what he said. I have been blamed by men of science, both in this country and in England, for quoting the Bible in confirmation of the doctrines of physical geography. The Bible, they say, was not written for scientific purposes and is therefore no authority in matters of science. I beg pardon. The Bible is authority for everything it touches. What would you think of an historian who should refuse to consult historical records of the Bible because the Bible was not written for the purposes of history? The Bible is true and science is true. All right, did you catch some of what Matthew Fontaine Maury referenced? He referenced that what he was doing was observation. What he was doing was looking at, mapping, and charting the ocean waters. And that in doing so, he was finding and seeing that there were these essentially rivers within the bodies of the ocean, these paths. And apparently, according to his quote, that he often in conversation and talking about it would quote the Bible. Well, what do we think that he was quoting? Well, quoting Psalm 8, quoting these passages that reference the ocean, its movement, its consistency, and details about it. And he goes on to say that the Bible's not a science textbook, and we would agree, and he would agree. But did you notice what he said? He said everything the Bible touches is accurate. Everything that it talks about is true. He recognized what inspiration really meant. He recognized that when something is inspired by God, it is accurate. If it's talking about things of science and nature and what we observe, but yet it's giving to us details and processes that we can relate to what we see, then the Bible is always true. All right, let's look at a third scientific foreknowledge that we find in nature, the accuracy within Scripture. All right, we think in our world and we depend in our world on the water cycle. So many places depend on this movement of moisture within the environment. If you're in the desert, then you appreciate every drop of rain. If you're in other parts of the world, during monsoon season, you recognize that there's floods of waters, but you also know that there's a season that's going to have drought and you have to survive through it. Okay, this cycle of water raining from the sky, pooling and gathering in streams and rivers, lakes, oceans, moving across the surface, gathering in ponds, but yet those little ponds of water that develop momentarily, a few days later, they're gone. They disappeared. You didn't necessarily see it. They were there one day. A few days later, they're gone. And then the next thing you know, there's clouds forming. You see the billows. Here comes a storm, the rain again. Today we understand rain, precipitation. We understand that the pooling of that water over time, it evaporates off the surface. We know that that water vapor is back up into our atmosphere, and that as it condenses on those tiny little dust grains and dirt grains, that it condenses and forms clouds. And at some point, the cloud is full. The cloud has more moisture than it can contain. The humidity changes, the temperature changes, a front blows in, and all of a sudden, now we have rain coming back down. When we look in the Scriptures and we look to the book of Ecclesiastes, and we think about Solomon, right, described as the wisest man, given wisdom by God, in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 7, I'm going to read a couple of verses here, and I want you to think about what he's describing. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 7. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. Okay, Solomon is seeing the natural processes, right? He's taking note, he's making note of things that can be seen with your eye, right? The fact that there is rivers running down from a hill or a mountainside. They're flowing into a larger body of water, and eventually all those rivers, all those bodies of water lead to the ocean. Solomon could go and visit the Mediterranean Sea, and he could see that it was there. But day after day, it wasn't more full. It wasn't necessarily overflowing its banks. The tides were coming in, but the tides were going back out. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, he goes a little bit further and he says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. So now Solomon is looking and he's saying, not just is there this flow of water along the surface that comes from the water that comes from the sky and it doesn't fill up, but yet somehow those clouds fill back up. When they are full, they empty themselves in rain. One more verse from the Old Testament. Amos chapter 9, verse 6, speaking of God, it says, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the face of the earth? So it's a reference to God in creation, God superintending all. But yet there is this process by which the waters are called from the sea, the waters that come from the sea, but eventually they're going to pour back out on the face of the earth. Here we have in Scripture, not the words that we have today, precipitation, evaporation, condensation, but we have this process outlined and described for us. Natural observations easily provide the knowledge of precipitation, rain, snow, hail, sleet, those kinds of things. These forms of water originating from clouds and storms, straightforward, right? Understanding. But the Bible also makes references to these more unusual occurrences in terms of being able to see. What Solomon brings up is the less obvious and more of the unknown processes of how the water makes its way from the earth back to the sky and the clouds. And today we understand it, the evaporation process. We need that sunlight and that energy impacting the water, creating it to form into vapor and to evaporate off the surface. All right, I want us to take a shift a little bit as we think about the scientific accuracy of Scripture. I want us to think now about medical ideas. Old Testament books of the law, right, Exodus through Deuteronomy, they contain laws and guidelines given to the Israelites as they began to structure themselves into a new nation. While we most often think about the old law given through Moses in its religious application, right? Sacrifices that were to be given, special feast days, and how the priests were to serve in the tabernacle. Amongst these religious applications, we also find that God gave laws that would guide the people in both a medical and health and sanitation type of framework. All right, this may seem a little strange, right? A strange aspect of the old law, but when we notice the context in which the Israelites had found themselves, it may give us some insight into some of the reasoning, all right? The Israelites had just spent hundreds of years in Egypt. Part of that time they were free, they fared well, and they lived slightly segmented in the land of Goshen, right? Joseph and his descendants. For the later years in Egypt, the Hebrews were enslaved. They were oppressed. They were forced to abide by Egyptian standards. They didn't have freedoms of their own choice, freedoms of their own choosing. They more or less probably had to fall in line with whatever was happening within their culture, civilization of the Egyptians. All right, we think about the Egyptians then. While Egypt was definitely advanced, an advanced civilization in many ways, right? They would perfect the process of mummification to a high degree. And along the way, they would document and understand the internal organs that they were dealing with. Okay. However, we find something interesting. We find in their writings, specifically an example of coming from the Ebers Papyrus. We see in their writings that it was simply man's discoveries and also man's interpretations, because we find various misconceptions for how to avoid infection, maybe how to correct even just small, simple issues, cuts and scrapes and nicks and burns. In the Ebers Papyrus, all right, this is a papyrus that was found, dated back to the mid-16th century BC, which places it around the time of the Hebrew captivity in Egypt. All right? In this papyrus, fascinating, right? Historical, absolutely. What it said, no reason to doubt that it was conveying knowledge that was known, shared, past. It was inscribed in this long papyrus. We see that they combined a medical viewpoint, but with their magical views. They included specific verbal incantations that had to accompany the prescribed remedy. We see them using herbal remedies, supplements, but also a variety of things that we know today would cause infection, using the dung from several animals or the blood of some type of reptile as a concoction to spread across your skin or into your wound. Okay, we see that there's something off with that. All right, that's the context where we see the Israelites coming out of. We see then in Exodus through Deuteronomy that there are laws and guidelines given by God that include some ways of life, some practices and behaviors and actions. So let's take a look at a few of those biblical references, kind of where we see some simple statements which in hindsight are very reasonable and through time have actually been forgotten, not followed, and had a negative consequence. All right, the first one that I want to look at is just a simple phrase that we find in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. It talks about how the life of the flesh is in the blood. Okay, the life of the flesh is in the blood. We know that as part of the religious processes that the Israelites would have, it was sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and there was the spilling of blood. So this connection, this idea that blood was central to life, well, it's stated in their law, but observation would have said it has some importance as well. And so it became a part of the law. But here is the connection that of life and health with one's blood, that sometimes information and content that is accurate, that maybe is not fully understood at the time, but if followed is fine, but if forgotten, brings those negative consequences. We look to the early history of the United States, the very first president, George Washington. In the records relating to his death, here is a man who had fought in the Revolutionary War, had been in places of cold, had been in places of hunger, had been in horrible conditions, right? But later on, he would be president, he would become sick. The doctors came in and they attended to them, and a practice at that time in history was known as bloodletting. All right? The thought is that you have a sickness, you have a disease, that disease is in your body, okay, not all that wrong, but yet it is part of your blood, that it is now infected your blood in such a way that we need to strip the blood out because it will carry out all of the evil toxins, leaving the good. After numerous occurrences of bloodletting, George Washington had given somewhere maybe around 5 to 7 pints of blood in a matter of hours. Usually a blood donation takes a pint or two. Here, they continually draw more blood, let more blood out, drain more blood because he's not getting better. And he didn't get better. And so his passing is usually ascribed to the weakening of his body through this process. But yet, blood has life-giving properties, something that in the Old Testament was very sacred that you needed to focus on and understand. All right, if we move back in time from the Revolutionary period, but also move to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy continues kind of a re-giving of laws and giving more information on some of them, explaining those laws. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 12 and 14, it talks about burying human waste outside the camp. Okay? So we understand at this period in time where for a period after the law is given, they are nomadic travelers, the Israelites are. All right, so they are setting up camp. They don't have sewage systems. They don't have running water the way that we think about it in modern day. And so their waste would gather. But in the law, it said you needed to take this out. It is a sanitation issue. It needs to be taken outside of the camp. You know, poor sanitation has been a thorn in the side of civilizations for years and years, all through history, even up into the time of like the Dark Ages in Europe and Asia. There was a large plague, sometimes called Black Death, sometimes the bubonic plague, that swept across Europe and Asia, killing 13 million people in Europe. And conservatively, across all of Europe and Asia, 75 to 200 million people died. In researching the history of this plague and what surrounded it, sanitation was a major issue that we see. Historians who look back at records of the practices and the behaviors, cities and the collection of people, not wrong, not right, but yet when you collect lots of people in a small region, you have to take care of certain things. And across these cities, for generations, that had not been the case, to where you had just enormous dung heaps that were part of the city landscape. Well, because of this, we understand today that that is where germs and disease and sickness and bacteria and viruses thrive in that kind of setting. All right. Let's turn and look at the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, there are some laws that relate to food consumption. When we think about Judaism, sometimes we do think about restrictions on diet. In Leviticus 11, verse 7, they were prohibited to eat swine. Today, we understand that pork is a meat that has to take extra care. We see in the discussion that they were forbidden from it, but it was not necessarily that everybody outside or around or the Gentile world was sinful in their practices or eating of swine. We would turn to the pages of the New Testament where God talks to Peter and shows him and says, there were some requirements of your diet. Now, that has been taken away. Of course, the greater principle in that context was that the gospel was open to the Gentile world as well. But here we see a nomadic people, maybe with limited abilities to take care of and cook properly and be attuned to some of these things, right? Carry the waste out, carry the dead out, to limit yourself from certain things that you might eat. Okay, we see that it is very reasonable, very understandable, maybe a good practice, especially in their case. If we look a few verses down in Leviticus 11, 9 through 12, there is a prohibition against some aquatic animals. And I want to read you a quote from a manual that was given to the U.S. Navy. And in this manual, it says this: all the important fish with poisonous flesh lack ordinary scales. Instead, these poisonous fish are covered with bristles or spiny scales, strong, sharp thorns or spines, or are encased in a bony box-like covering. Some have naked skin, that is, no spines or scales. So in this context, you can see that in this mid-1940s U.S. manual for the Navy, hey, there are some fish you just ought to avoid. Could you potentially eat them, cook them, and be okay? Sure. But there's also a great danger to it. Well, in Leviticus, we see a reference to this same thing, fish without fins or fish without scales to avoid. All right, we turn and we think about another health medical sanitation. In the book of Numbers, it talks about laws of washings and purification. It talks about how, verse 11, he who touches a dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. In verse 14 of chapter 19, this is the law: when a man dies in a tent, all who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean. Verse 17, and for an unclean person, okay, those previous times of occurrence of coming across death, they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer, burnt for purification from sin. Running water shall be put on them in a vessel. A clean person shall take hyssop, dip it in the water, sprinkle it on, and that unclean person is to wash. All right, there is a prescription earlier in Numbers 19 of formulating this liquid substance by which they are to wash. Essentially, it was similar to what we would think maybe today as lye soap. In the early 1900s or in the mid 1900s, lye soap was something that you could make at home, use to wash and to clean. I want to give you one example here. In the mid 1800s, there was a medical doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, a Austrian. This man served in a hospital in Austria where pregnant mothers would come to have their babies. He was there to take care of them. He was the director of that hospital. What he saw was that they had a mortality rate of 18%. Mothers came in, 18% of them died. Well, mothers who went through midwives, they had a 3% mortality rate. This confused him, right? Because the hospital is the most talented, the most skilled, the most knowledgeable, the best advances in technology. Why is this happening? And as the story goes, it plagued him for why this could happen, until it is one of his coworkers, a surgeon, was performing an autopsy and nicked themselves. Well, they went and washed and did the things of their day. That fellow surgeon eventually died, and he died of the same thing that these women were dying of, and they were calling it labor fever, but this was a man who was not in labor. All right, so Semmelweis looked at the situation, and as he watched it, he saw that the medical students would go to do their autopsies, and they would train. They would work on that dead body, and after they were done, they would turn They would go and wash all of them through a common bowl of rinse water. They would dry their hands on a common towel, and then they would enter in to do examinations on live women. When Semmelweis saw this and changed the procedure and said, instead of a common bowl, we're going to use chlorinated water, individually washing, individually drying, what he found was the death rate plummeted from 18% to 2%, maybe even down to 1% in his hospitals. All right, what did Semmelweis rediscover? Well, he rediscovered the fact that there is a clean and unclean in the handling of death, in the handling of sickness. When we think about Genesis or Psalms or Ecclesiastes, all of these books that we have discussed in this lesson, they go back thousands of years. They predate much of our scientific understanding, but yet when we read them, we see, while they're not technologically advanced, they are bringing about principles and processes and understanding that is reasonable and always right. Scientific accuracy and foreknowledge. You know, if the Bible claims to contain elements beyond human production, and it does have those, then it must be of divine origin. We have looked at evidences that the Bible does contain elements beyond human production and is therefore inspired. We have talked about the internal evidences of brevity and unity. We've looked at consistency and interdependency. We've looked at factual accuracy within the internal pages. We've then stepped outside the Bible, talked about archaeology and scientific processes that relate to Scripture, all of them proving to be true and accurate and right. When we turn to Scripture and we look at the pages of the Bible, what is it that we find? We find something that is beyond a human production, and that means it's God's. Thank you for joining us.